So this is a review for Sniffles Takes a Trip, released in 1940. It's the 286th in the series, and it's directed by Chuck Jones. You can find this short in two ways. There's an unrestored version on the Looney Tunes Golden Collection Volume 6 DVD set. However, it's been beautifully restored in high definition for the Looney Tunes Mouse Chronicles Blu-ray and DVD set, which has all the Sniffles shorts, which I know that's something a lot of you are excited about, but regardless of your feelings, the short looks amazing. Now, it is under copyright, so I can't play the full short here, otherwise Warner Bros. Will just take it down. So unless they put it up on their channel, you're not going to see it on YouTube. But in case you haven't seen this one, not too much happens. It's essentially Sniffles the mouse visiting the country, wanting to get some rest, but he ends up getting scared from some of the sounds and things that happen on his way to the countryside, and he runs back to the city, and that's pretty much it. So with this short, I'm going to go through some of the references and whatever else regarding it, but I'm going to be joined all throughout this review by my good friend Matt Hunter, and he's going to put his thoughts in between what I'm going to say in this short as I go through it from start to finish.
Gee willikers!
So before I do that, just letting you guys know, this is the fourth Sniffles short, so Sniffles, I guess, proved popular enough for Jones to continue with, because he had 3 shorts released in 1939, and Jones had only just recently started directing at the studio around this time, taking over Frank Tashlin's unit. So this short, yeah, it continues Chuck Jones's Disney style of directing, which he himself admitted he was trying to ape Disney because who else was there? I mean, one could argue the Fleischer Studios could have been aped as well, but hey, Disney was seen as king at the time, so you can't really blame him for saying that. So this one, if you're used to the Jones shorts later on, his absolute masterpieces, What's Opera Doc, The Hunting Trilogy, and so on, you're gonna look at this short and think, is this Chuck Jones? Doesn't look like Chuck Jones. Well, at this point in time, these are the sort of shorts he makes, and before he himself admitted he found out how to be funny once he actually made the short The Draft Horse, released a few years after this one. But if you watch these earlier Chuck Jones shorts with this in mind, that you're watching a director trying to find his way, trying to find his style, and copying who were basically the kings of animation at the time, I think you can have an interesting time. I'd completely understand if you prefer stuff that he did collaborating with Michael Maltese and that sort of thing, and I totally get it. But I also find it interesting seeing how a director finds his or her way via their earlier works.
You have to realize, too, that this type of cartoon with the kind of cute protagonist and gentle humor was very popular with audiences at the time. I mean, Disney had made it popular. MGM, Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising, who actually came from Warner Brothers and started their own studio at MGM, they were doing this kind of humor and this kind of cartoon. And what I think is really interesting is that there's a theme that Chuck Jones uses in this one, and you can also think of cartoons like Tom Thumb in Trouble and his other Disney-influenced works, is that there's a small character in a big world. And the way he does it in this cartoon, it looks more lavish than it is. If you notice, it's a lot of backgrounds and a lot of angles, a lot of still paintings. So you actually see this little mouse, Sniffles, in this countryside environment, and he gets scared of all the various wildlife. It really kind of resembles the scene in Disney's Snow White, where she's walking into the woods and she sees eyeballs in the tree trunks and things like that. So it's not only an imitation of Disney, but it's also an experiment with size and angle and how to make a very impressive looking cartoon on less of a budget than maybe Disney was doing at the time.
So the story in this one, it actually comes across as a rather loose version of a Disney short. It's a silly symphony called The Country Cousin. And that features a country mouse walking on the train tracks in the beginning, which is what you see in the beginning of this short. In fact, apparently, the designer of Sniffles, a gentleman by the name of Charles Thorson, based Sniffles from the mouse in The Country Cousin, so that makes sense. There was also an Aesop fable about a country mouse visiting a town mouse, and after a few events happening in the town, the country mouse is like, nope, see you later, I'm going back to the country where I much prefer it. Here it seems to be the opposite, where you've got a town mouse, Sniffles, going to the countryside and decides to take a trip for rest and relaxation, and yeah, we'll go through it anyway in terms of what he discovers. So right away, after the unfortunate Blue Ribbon titles, the original titles are assumed to be lost, although apparently someone has the original titles, but anyway, the official release is Blue Ribbon, but what's most important is what's in the short itself.
Sniffles cartoons were reissued, and they were reissued well into the 1960s, I believe it is. Sniffles was an incredibly popular character. The Warner Brothers merchandising department, first under Leon Schlesinger, and then well after that, merchandised Sniffles quite a bit. And even after Jones lost interest in him at the end of the 1940s, they continued reissuing the cartoons, and Sniffles was also very popular as a feature in the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies comic books by Dell and Goldkey, the banner of Western Publishing, where they paired him with a little girl that originated in a Friz Freleng cartoon, actually called Beauty and the Beast. At least that's where they think the inspiration came from, Mary Jane. And it was Mary Jane and Sniffles. And the premise of that series was basically the little mouse gives Mary Jane magic words and magic dust that allows her to shrink down to his size. And then he goes on adventures, once again, in small character in a big world, with the little girl. And it's pretty charming, and that was popular well into the 70s, I think. So Sniffles was a well-known character, and those reissues were very, very popular with audiences.
So we start off with a beautiful background, but then we hear Sniffles sing, which I would assume that this part might turn people off from watching it.
Oh boy, I'm on my way to have a healthy holiday. I'm off to roam the countryside where all the squirrels and chipmunks hide. I'll listen to the birds and bees, smell the flowers, climb the trees, and I'll go swimming in the brooks just like the ones in picture books.
Way cute even than what Disney did, but anyway, in case you're wondering who does the voice of Sniffles here, that's Margaret Hill-Tabor, and she did the voice of Sniffles in the first few entries during Chuck's, I guess, quote-unquote, cutesy phase. But if you look at the railroad tracks, and this is something that's interesting, and it was one of the ways that they needed to keep costs in check, so to speak, look very closely at the railroad, and you can pretty much pinpoint where they started to reuse that foreground. Does that mean it's anything bad that you can notice it if you pay close attention? No, of course not, but it's just something I noticed when watching this short again. And I guess I needed something to keep my mind off of the song being sung, but that's okay. You know, Jones clearly did this to set up the whole idea that, yep, Sniffles is on his way for a holiday. From what? I don't know. I don't know what his job is or whatever. But anyway, I'm overthinking it, okay? But, you know, whether you like the short or not, and I'd imagine a lot of you probably wouldn't, you have to admit that's a good way to start things off. So Sniffles continues to sing way out of key, and I'd imagine someone who's an actual musician might listen to this and go, oof, that's pretty bad. But anyway, I guess that's sort of the point of it. Then his singing is interrupted by a crow, which he says, oh look, a robin. I guess the joke is that because he's from the city or town or whatever, he has no idea but what countryside flora and fauna is supposed to be, but whatever.
I think it's kind of a charming way to introduce the character. I mean, obviously he's innocent, he's naive, and he's cute. And that's kind of what they were going for. Somebody like Tex Avery would have turned this on its ear after about, 2 seconds. There would have been some kind of a payoff, a gag or something to point out that Sniffles is an awful singer. But no, this is unironic. I mean, it's just straightforward. This is what we're going to get. The character's cute. He's out of his element. And here we go.
So anyway, he sees a sign saying Country Meadows, and then he pulls out a brochure, and he has to check the brochure and the sign a few times to make sure that, yep, this is the right place. It's interesting comparing this to Chuck Jones of later years, because this whole thing could have been really shortened. You didn't need this additional flourish of panning over backwards and forwards and so on. Although I do like Carl Stalling using the flute to go back and forward here, which is a nice little touch, but again, it's slow. And yes, Sniffles is like, gee willikers. We really need to put that back into the vernacular, don't we?
Golly, gee willikers.
Well, we probably don't need to bring that back into the vernacular per se, but if you'll notice about the later works of Chuck Jones, this kind of has some foreshadowing to that. If you look at how Jones handles a very similar situation, look no further than the later cartoon, Lumberjack Rabbit, which was actually the first cartoon that Warner Brothers wanted to make in 3D. And then that craze diminished and it wasn't necessary to do it that way anymore. But again, you have angles and stark backgrounds and a small character in a big world. And it opens with Bugs Bunny singing a song as he's traveling along. Then what he finds out is Paul Bunyan's garden and everything's gigantic. But very similar setup, but he speeds it up in such a way. And of course, Mel Blanc was such a good singer that he could sing in character as Bugs Bunny. And it's a lot more enjoyable. But you can see kind of what Jones was later going to do.
So Sniffles then throws away the brochure and starts walking around, admiring the scenery. Okay, objectively, you didn't really need all these scenes with him looking at everything, but thankfully, A, it looks really, really good, especially in this restoration, and B, sets things up for later on because you're going to get a contrast to when things seemingly take a turn for when it turns to night. So I can see what Chuck Jones was trying to do here. There's no doubt that he would have sped things up that little bit had he made the short later on, but it's fine for what it is. I do admire what Jones tries to do next, where he continues looking around at the scenery, which, again, one could argue could have been shortened and so on, but at least he does pick up the pace a little bit in the cutting here, so he'll look at one thing, it'll take a while, back to Sniffles, look at another thing, look for a while, back to Sniffles, but then the more things he looks at, the quicker the cutting becomes, and I think this is one of those things that Jones learns from and applies it to future shorts. And again, you can't deny that it looks stunning, even though it could have been shortened by a fair bit.
Well, Anthony, I think that's part of the very reason right there that these cartoons actually got their own Blu-ray set, their own standalone set. They actually paired them with Hubie and Bertie and called it Chuck Jones Mouse Chronicles. But these cartoons look stunning in HD, restored, and they are such a visual upgrade from what most of us grew up with watching on the Turner networks on TNT, TBS, Cartoon Network. They used these old AAP TV masters that were really faded. Everything looked kind of brown and murky. And to see this cartoon the way it was intended, it's a revelation. A lot of these early Chuck Jones cartoons are because of his use of color and shading and lighting. And it's just amazing what he was able to do and what all of us never saw for a long, long time. So they are a revelation. They're not funny per se, but they're gorgeously made. And I think they definitely stand out.
So Sniffles grabs the binoculars and looks around. Again, more lovely scenery. And again, this could have been shortened. I know. But we get a rather amusing drawing of these gigantic eyes, and it kind of looks like a mustache, doesn't it, there as well. But sure enough, it's a fly. And he just scares him by saying boo, and that's it. So there was a potential for a funny gag here, but it doesn't exactly live up to what it could have been. But that's okay. It's not really the kind of short that Jones would do until later on anyway. And we get a little setup where Sniffles sets up a hammock and decides he wants to take a nap, saying, "It certainly is peaceful this afternoon," and we then see a woodpecker, and we all know where this is going. The woodpecker's going to disturb his sleep. Sadly, the scene doesn't really work because the timing that Jones will develop later on just isn't there. Although it is pretty fast, you can see some smears happening here, and again, I think Jones did learn something from doing this short, and as he applied this effect in future shorts. And there's also no real payoff here either, but one could argue that this particular scene, even though it didn't really have much of a punchline, is really more of another setup for the scene that follows. And in the next scene, Sniffles sets up the hammock again, and you can sort of see something's not quite right when he sets it up, and sure enough, it's a crane. And I do like the animation here of the crane walking and Sniffles is still sleeping, plus all the added color that you can see with the added shadows. So the crane walks underwater, which is what cranes would do, and we go underwater with a wonderful warped glass effect to show that Sniffles is underwater. And what song do we hear underwater? I'm forever blowing bubbles. Ha ha. But that's okay. But again, because Jones's timing isn't here like the future shorts, it doesn't realize its full potential here, although when he does climb up and goes on to the crane itself, we do get the funniest shot in this entire short.
Yeah, Sniffles looking up the beak of this crane is hysterical. It's a great shot, a great perspective shot, and the crane's expression with the kind of narrowed eyes. I think that's great. It's too slow. I agree. The pacing could have been shortened quite a bit, but that is a great shot. I love that. It's funny.
But after that, Sniffles falls down, the crane flies off. Again, there's no real payoff there, but Sniffles notices a pair of eyes and thinks it's an alligator, which I guess is a callback to the earlier joke about Sniffles mistaking what type of bird he saw, where he's a city mouse and he doesn't really know his animals. In any case, he says an alligator and runs, and sure enough, it's a frog, which I'm pretty sure you would all expect by this point.
An alligator. An alligator. Ah, an alligator.
So now we see the sun is setting, which is a lovely effect here. In fact, Jones's short, that adaptation of the Canyon Kitties that he did earlier in 1940, this is why I want to see that restored, because you're going to see the beautiful effects like this, even though that short isn't particularly great. But anyway, we get to see it here once again. This would have been sped up had Jones done this short later on, but anyway, we can still admire the effect here because this was not done by computers. This was all done by hand and makes it even more amazing to look at in my book. Now, one could argue that the fire scene here is the highlight of this short from an artistic point of view. I mean, look at the shadows, look at the light, and what Chuck Jones does here. And to top it all off, you've got the wonderful animation of Sniffles being freaked out, trying to keep himself calm, but every time he hears a noise, he gasps and looks over. And it's nothing more than just your regular animals walking around, but being a city mouse or town mouse, he doesn't really know what all these noises actually are.
Yeah, it certainly is peaceful out here tonight in the dark. All right. It's sure nice and dark. All right. Oh.
And also, a lot of the score in this is actually an original composition by Carl Starling, and I just loved how he scored this scene as well. Just the way every time the music would change, every time Sniffles would react to something. In fact, this whole scene is pretty much a contrast to earlier on. Remember when he was excited about being in countryside, he's looking on at certain animals, and then with every cut, Jones would zoom in closer and closer to Sniffles' face, showing the joy in being out in the countryside during the day. He does the same thing here, except he zooms in closer and closer as Sniffles gets more and more frightened. So again, I can see what Chuck was trying to do, and again, would he have executed this better later on? Yes. But at least I can appreciate that Jones was still working things out at this time. And make no mistake, when we see the eyes in the trees and those scary silhouettes, clearly Jones was influenced by Snow White here. He would have had to have been. The movie came out a few years prior to this, so it was still fresh in everyone's minds, and it blew people away at the time. I don't think people today appreciate just how big of a deal Snow White actually was when it first came out, and no doubt it would have influenced Chuck Jones at the time. So, of course, why not use it here? It's definitely appropriate, and it works really well, especially with the different colors now. reflecting the mood of Sniffles as he's getting more and more afraid.
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier, and I can also see the influence from an earlier Disney short called The Old Mill from 1937, where there are a bunch of animals living in a windmill and a thunderstorm kicks up, and the old mill is taxed to the limit in terms of what it can do, and all the animals inside of it reacting to it. And just the technical wizardry that it took the Disney studio to pull that off and make it convincing and make it interesting. You can see the influence of that in this cartoon as well.
And then the cuts get faster and faster, and even the animation gets faster and faster as Sniffle gets more and more afraid until finally he snaps and is like, nope, I've had enough, and runs off. We see Sniffles run back to the city, so I guess he's a city mouse, not a town mouse, but anyway, he could have been from both, or maybe the city's on the way, who knows. But it's a lovely final shot, and we even see that wonderful little light in the background as well, and we end right there. So, look, objectively, there were definitely things here that Chuck would do much better later on, but in watching this short, putting into context where Chuck Jones was as a director at the time, what his sensibilities were, it's still not a great short, okay? But it is something I can watch and still admire in terms of its artistic direction at the very least. And I've always liked looking at certain directors' earlier works, regardless of whether it's animated or live action, because I like to see the journey about where they actually came from. Like even, say, Steven Spielberg's works before Jaws, or even George Lucas before he did Star Wars, watching those other films as well. Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola. If you watch a lot of the director's earlier works, it's interesting to see what they were trying to do before they finally, quote-unquote, figured things out and they had their own style.
Yes, and I think this is definitely one of those cartoons that shows director Chuck Jones' progress. This is like one of his early, really good ones, and the reason being, you can clearly see the Disney influence. You can totally see it in this cartoon, but then you see what he got rid of, which is the slow pacing, and then what he kept, which is the impressive angles and the characters' reactions. Look at the trilogy of cartoons pairing Porky Pig and Sylvester in kind of a horror theme. You've got Scaredy Cat and Claws for Alarm and Jumpin' Jupiter, and you can see Sylvester and Porky's reactions to scary elements. It's very similar to what Sniffles is doing here. And then you look at the cartoons like Beanstalk Bunny or Lumberjack Rabbit, where Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck are placed in situations where the world is bigger than they are and they have to react to that. The influence remained, but Jones added his own flair to it. He sped things up. He made things a little bit more concise. And it's really cool to see as his career progressed what he kept and what he didn't.
In terms of entertainment value, this one is probably a 6 out of 10 for me. It's not particularly great from that point of view, but from an artistic point of view, I'll give it a much higher 9 out of 10. Yeah, so I got 2 scores for this one, alright? And then later on, I'm glad that Jones, once he becomes quote-unquote funnier, he ends up redesigning Sniffles and he becomes a lot more funnier and more talkative, pretty much like I am in this review. But in any case, that will do it for this review. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and until next time, take care.